Welcome to the Lubar Center at Marquette Law School, where we are releasing today our latest national poll with results connected to largely the United States Supreme Court. I'm Alan Borsuk. I'm a senior fellow here, and I'll be posing the questions, but the man with the answers is Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Poll. This is, I believe I'm correct, the 11th time we've done a national poll like this. We started in 2019, and more recent times we've been doing them once every 2 months, so we really had a running measure of what people nationwide think of the court and of the issues before the court and justices and the whole shebang. So let's begin with a little bit about the mechanics of this.
Absolutely. Yeah, as people might notice, the court's been sort of at the center of a lot of things these days, so it's a good time to be polling about the court frequently, as we do every 2 months now, and as we see developments as the court issues opinions and as legal issues come and go, and sometimes justices come and go. So in this survey, we were in the field November 15th through the 22nd. This is a national survey in all 50 states. We interviewed 1,004 adults nationwide, and the survey has a margin of error of plus or minus 3.7 percentage points.
And we've been keeping an eye on just the broad question of what do people feel about the court in terms of approval or disapproval of the court's work overall. What do we got this time?
Well, here, what we're looking at, we're used to seeing presidential approval ratings that we do all the time, and we judge in part how a presidency is doing by the rise and fall of approval. Now, with the Supreme Court, we're doing the same thing. In this survey, 44% approve of the job the court's doing, 56% disapprove. So substantially underwater as these things go. That is a little bit of an upturn from 40% approval and 60% disapproval in September. Both of these numbers are well below where we were as recently as July of 2021, so a little over almost a year and a half ago, when approval was at 60% with 39% disapproval. So this set of 15, 16 months, whatever it's been since July of 2021, has been a period of really rapid and substantial change in approval of the court, substantially driven by a variety of abortion-related decisions. But also we've seen periods of some recovery in the court standing as well. In the current period, we saw a drop in May after the leaked opinion in the Dobbs decision on abortion. Then a further decline in approval in July after that Dobbs decision actually came out, hitting a low of 38% approval, then up slightly to 40% in September, and now slightly further up to 44% now. Still an underwater rating for the court at this point.
Opinion on the court is not spread evenly across the partisan spectrum. This is not, I guess, a huge surprise, but what do we got?
No, but it does line up with what you might imagine partisan reaction to the court's rulings have been. Republicans are very positive towards the court. 70% of Republicans approve of the job the court's doing, but that falls to 40% approval, 60% disapproval among independents. And Democrats are practically a mirror image of Republicans. Only 28% of Democrats approve, 72% disapprove. One more thing that's striking is if we went back to July of 2021, which in some ways doesn't seem that long ago, in other ways it does, then that month there was almost no difference in approval between Democrats and Republicans. They were both within a couple of points of 60% approval of the court. So I think this divide in partisanship is part of what drives the decline in the court's overall approval rating, but it also reflects how very different partisan views of the court are now than they were not quite 18 months ago.
The court session for this year is underway, started in October. Let's look at a few of the big cases they've got coming up.
We've been looking at, of course, a variety of cases before the court, but three that are being considered, or at least heard for oral argument in October and coming up in December, involve three pretty important cases. One is the role that consideration of race is playing in college admissions. Those cases, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and Students for Fair Admissions versus the University of North Carolina, are two separate cases, but they were heard together at oral argument on October 31st. And this addresses the longstanding practice of how colleges and universities can consider issues of race in their admissions process. A second case deals with religious and free speech rights of businesses and whether a business can decline services to lesbian and gay patrons based on that business owner's religious or speech rights. And finally, a case concerning state legislatures and something that's sometimes called the independent legislatures theory. And this addresses with the question of whether state legislatures are the sole authority for setting the terms and conditions of federal elections under the U.S. Constitution, or in this particular case, whether the state courts can intervene in legislative decisions, in this case concerning redistricting, but with the broader argument that legislatures are more immune from review by other state actors like state courts. So three pretty consequential cases. These last two, the free speech and LGBTQ liberty question and the state legislatures questions, are being argued December 5th and December 7th for the state legislatures. So those two are coming up. But the first case on race and admissions is a case or a pair of cases that were argued October 31st, shortly before our survey went in the field.
And let's take them one by one, starting with the use of race as a factor in college admissions.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to mention up front is substantial percentages of the public say they haven't heard of these cases or haven't heard enough to have an opinion about them. That's hardly surprising. Many really important Supreme Court decisions don't rise to the top of public consciousness. So the first point is that 42% say they haven't heard enough about the use of race in admissions to have an opinion. But 41% would like the court to ban the use of race in admissions. Just 16% would like to continue that use of race for college admissions. And if we take just the people that have heard enough to have an opinion about this, so the people that are more aware of the issue, 72% would ban the use of race, 28% would continue allowing colleges to use race as one among several different considerations. And here is a question we've been monitoring in 4 polls now since 2021, and we've seen this same balance of opinion throughout. We're not seeing a lot of movement on this issue.
And the LGBT issue.
Well, I've got more on race first.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. What we see, though, is this opposition to the use of race in admissions is widespread across different categories. So we look at it among different racial and ethnic groups. But again, the balance of opinion, especially among those with an opinion, is opposed to the use of race across groups. Among whites, 73% would ban the use of race in admissions, but a majority, 56% of black people with an opinion on this issue would also favor banning the use of race, as would 74% of Hispanic folks and 84% of those in other or multiracial categories. And again, this finding has held up consistently over the 4 times we've asked about it. You might also think that people more concerned about racism in American society would be more favorable to the use of race as a consideration in admissions. But again, we find that, again, while a lot of people haven't thought about it, of those who have an opinion, a majority in each category of views about racism would nevertheless ban the use of race in admissions. Of those people who say racism is a very big problem in our country today, 54% would ban the use of race in admissions, 46% would allow it to continue. But when we look at people who say racism is a moderately big problem, that goes up to 73% who would not use race in admissions. And of those who think it's a small or not a problem at all, racism isn't, 88% would ban the use of race in admissions. Finally, our favorite is partisan categories, where we do see a divide by party, but even here, a slight majority of Democrats, 53%, favor the elimination of race as a consideration in admissions, a number that goes up to 70% with independents and 86% with Republicans. So the bottom line here is that across racial categories, across categories of concern with racism, and across partisan categories, we see a majority of those with an opinion opposed to the use of race. And as I've said, that's something that holds up across the 4 different times over the last little more than a year that we've asked about this question.
Now, LGBT issues, can a business owner not serve them based on the business owner's free speech or religious rights?
That's right. Excuse me. This is a case called 303 Creative versus Elenis out of Colorado, I believe. And this is one of an ongoing series of cases in which the court's been asked to rule how much does a business or an organization's religious liberty rights or free speech rights allow them to choose not to serve or provide services to a particular group, in this case, lesbian and gay people, even though those folks are in a category that's protected by anti-discrimination law. And so this is the clash of the liberty rights of speech and religion versus the anti-discrimination rights for a particular class of people. On this one, again, a fair number of people, 35%, say they haven't heard enough about this to have an opinion. But of those who have heard about it, 39% favor allowing the business to deny service, but 61% oppose allowing a business to decline service to lesbian and gay people on the basis of that business owner's preferences and rights.
How does this line up with people's views on same-sex marriage?
And here there's a strong relationship that people who supported the court's decision Obergefell establishing a right to same-sex marriages are very different from people who are opposed to that decision. Now, a solid majority favored the same-sex marriage ruling, but a significant minority opposed that still. What we see in this case is of those who favor a right to same-sex marriage, 77% say a business should not be able to refuse services to lesbian and gay folks, while those who are opposed to same-sex marriage, 80% say the business should be allowed to refuse service. So here you see a new case dealing with when discrimination law can be effective and when it can be overcome by other liberties and rights claimed by business owners. But that lines up very well, as you see here, with people's opinions about the basic same-sex marriage ruling.
We ask in our polling, one of the questions is about your own religious orientation or practices or beliefs, and you analyze the results based on people's religious affiliation.
This case is partly about free speech rights and partly about religious liberty rights, so the two are a little bit related. What we find is that, again, many people don't have an opinion, but of those who do, people who think of themselves as born-again Christians or born-again Protestants favor allowing businesses to deny service. 73% and 27% of evangelicals or born-again folks oppose that decision. Majorities in each of the other religious categories that we analyze say that businesses should not be allowed to deny services. Among mainline Protestant denominations, 62% oppose this exception for businesses. Among Roman Catholics, 65%. Among those in other religious groups, which granted is a whole conglomeration of other religious groups, 62% oppose the exception for businesses. And finally, for people who have no religious affiliation, 77% oppose that. So a widespread opposition to allowing businesses to make these decisions to deny service, but with the exceptions that we've just seen among born-again Protestants and among people who oppose same-sex marriage.
The so-called independent legislatures idea, what's the public opinion on that? That's one is a little harder to understand for the general public. It's a little more complex.
Well, and there are two parts to it. One is, first of all, 70% say they haven't heard enough to have an opinion. So we really are looking at a case that has not penetrated to public awareness hardly at all. But it's a case that at its extreme limits would have really substantial implications, though there's certainly no reason to think the Supreme Court will necessarily go to those most extreme claims. What this rests on is that in the Constitution, legislatures are given the power to determine the conduct of federal elections with some federal limits on that. The argument in this case is that the legislature passed a congressional districting bill. The state Supreme Court struck that down, and now the legislature's argument is that the Supreme Court didn't have the authority to redraw the maps because under the Constitution, the legislature has sole authority to do that. So if you push that to its limit, it says that legislatures can act with respect to federal elections without the check or balance of judicial scrutiny of their actions. A narrower decision in this case could address simply the details of the districting case before it, but some advocates are certainly pushing for this stronger construction that legislatures really do have very strong authority without the check or the oversight of state courts in those decisions. So it's a complicated case, but one that has potentially large ramifications going forward. And even in the narrower sense of gerrymandering or congressional districting, the U.S. Supreme Court recently said the federal courts have no role to play in gerrymandering decisions, but the state courts might. So here we're seeing another case involving districting decisions in which the state courts are trying to play a role and in which the legislature is saying, no, we can't be controlled by our state courts. So a complicated decision. As I said, fully 70% haven't heard much about this, and so you might reasonably say that the public doesn't have much information about it. Of those that do say they know enough to give an answer, 25% favor legislatures having this authority, 75% oppose that. This is one to watch, though, over the coming months as the court hears the arguments and reaches a decision on this case, probably sometime next summer, because this is one where the public may come to know more about this case, especially if the ruling is one that confers broader powers on legislatures that would surely be controversial. At this point, it's potentially controversial, but not widely enough known yet for the public to have a lot of opinions about it. And we do see a party split on this. Republicans a little bit more in favor, 55-45 of those with an opinion, but Democrats and independents solidly opposed.
So let's turn to the distant past, well, at least several months ago. Things seem so distant sometimes. And we, as we have done in the past, we're particularly interested in people's views of the Dobbs decision, the abortion decision going back to June. What did we find this time?
Very little change in opinion, actually, over the course of the month since the June decision. 33% say they favor the Dobbs decision, striking down Roe, but 66% are opposed to that ruling. We've been asking about this for a long time now, since 2021 even, and opinion on balance has not changed very much. In our September poll, 33% favored and 67% opposed the Dobbs decision, so that's almost the same as where we are this time. And in July, it was 36 favor, 64 opposed, so maybe a slightest downturn in support for the decision, but it's very, very slight. And the bigger picture over more than 2 years is how stable opinion has been on whether to sustain Roe versus Wade or whether to strike it down, with a really 2-to-1 majority opposed to striking it down.
Another case not quite as high profile in the public mind that we've been following was a decision that also came last June, right? Yeah, that was in June also, out of New York about gun rights.
Yeah, this is a case involving whether there's an individual right under the Fifth Amendment to possess a gun outside the home as opposed to earlier possession inside the home.
Second Amendment?
Second Amendment, what did I say?
Fifth.
Gonna fail con law.
Take the fifth on this one.
Yes. I'm sure that was just a slip of the tongue. Definitely a Second Amendment gun rights case. New York State Rifle and Pistol versus Bruin. Here the court ruled in favor of that gun right to possess a gun outside the home. And here, unlike the abortion decision, the public is very much in favor of the court's ruling. 64% in favor of the decision, 35% opposed. And again, we followed this one for some time, and opinion has remained on balance in favor of this extension of gun rights. In September, it was 57% in favor, as opposed to the 64 we see now, so a bit of an upturn. though that 64 now is also in line with the mid-60s that we saw during the fall of 2021 and the spring of 2022. So it looks like support may have dipped just a little bit over the summer and in September, but has now recovered to the levels that it was. So when we think back on this past session of the Supreme Court, the Dobbs decision stands head and shoulders in public visibility above others, but the gun rights decision was also a very important case, and one where the public on balance is pretty strongly in favor of how the court ruled, even as the public is on balance pretty strongly opposed to the abortion ruling.
Same-sex marriage.
Here we're looking back on some earlier decisions. If we think about the question of approval of the court, or sometimes people talk about the legitimacy of the court, one aspect of that is certainly whether the court is reaching decisions that fit with public opinion or not. Not that public opinion should control these decisions, but the court does rest on the public at some level, admitting the legitimacy of the decisions at least. On same-sex marriage, which the court ruled on in 2015, very strong majority, 72% now, favor that same-sex marriage decision, 28% are opposed. And support for this decision has been very strong in all 4 times that we've asked about it, with support at least 2/3 and reaching as high as this time almost 3/4 of the public in favor.
Even stronger opinions about discrimination in the workplace involving LGBT people.
Yes, in 2020, the court ruled that federal anti-discrimination law based on sex includes gay and transgender rights in the workplace. Here, support is even more strong in favor of that decision. 83% favor including LGBTQ people in anti-discrimination law, just 17% are opposed to that. And again, over 4 different times we've asked about this, support has never fallen below 83%. So quite strong support for this ruling of the court.
And a subject that was perhaps a little hotter before political redistricting was squared away for the next 8 or 9 years, but nonetheless an important matter, which is gerrymandering on partisan basis.
Here we go back to a 2019 court ruling that said the federal courts have no role in adjudicating challenges to partisan gerrymandering. This is the case I mentioned earlier that tossed these cases back to the state courts. Here, opinion is evenly divided. 52% support that ruling, 47% are opposed. I think, as Alan just said, gerrymandering is an issue that is very cyclical. It comes back about every 10 years as we go into the redistricting process. And so while debates over redistricting were pretty intense a year or 2 ago, I think we're maybe on the downward slide of salience on that issue right now.
In 2019, when we started these national polls focused on the court, opinion about the ideology of the court was that it was generally, there was pretty strong sentiment that it was generally kind of a middle-of-the-road group ideologically. That seems to have changed.
It's changed really quite dramatically as composition of the court has shifted and as some of the rulings have shifted as well. As of this survey, 61% say they see the court as either conservative or very conservative. But when we started this survey, started this question at least, in 2019, that number was just 38%. So we've gone from 38 to 61% seeing a conservative court. What's more, in 2019, 50% saw the court as moderate. That's down to 32% now. Very small percentage of people see the court as liberal or very liberal. So we're really looking here at the question of how centrist or how to the right is the court perceived. And the simple point is there's been really quite dramatic change in the perception of the court on these ideological grounds.
We've been interested in trying to measure the general knowledge people have of the Supreme Court, and one gauge for that is, do you know which party's presidents appointed the majority of justices?
You know, the court is this incredibly important institution of American politics and society, and yet it is not the thing that most people wake up in the morning and their first thought is, gosh, I wonder what the court's doing today. Instead, we experience the court in these episodes that are associated with when the court hands down rulings, and especially big rulings. When a vacancy occurs on the court and we go through the nomination process. But on the day-to-day business of the court, unless you're someone that, for professional or just plain curiosity reasons, wants to follow it closely, most people understandably don't have a day-to-day knowledge of the court in the way that they may have more of a day-to-day knowledge of what the president's doing, or even some of the bills or arguments going on in Congress. So we've looked at a variety of ways of measuring knowledge of the court and information about it. And it turns out one of the simplest actually works quite well, and that's just asking people whether they know or how sure they are which party's presidents have appointed a majority of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, that's 6 Republicans presidents and 3 Democratic presidents who have appointed the justices. I'm sorry, 3 of the justices have been appointed by Democratic presidents, 6 have been appointed by Republican presidents. There, get that right. And so the answer, of course, is a Republican majority, but it has, or Republican appointed majority, I should say. But it's something that many people are still behind the times on. And in this latest poll, 24%, 1 in 4, believe that there's either definitely or probably a majority of justices who were appointed by Democratic presidents, something that's not been true for a long, long time now. 40% say it's a Republican-appointed majority, but only probably a Republican-appointed majority. And 36% say it's definitely a Republican-appointed majority. So I think here you see the limits on this awareness, including something as strongly political in the sense of our nomination and appointment process and the fights we've had about appointments and nominations over the last 6 or so years, that still just a little over a third of the public is completely confident about and correct about the majority appointments of the court. If you want to say the glass is half full, about 3/4 think it's probably a Republican-appointed majority, leaving a quarter that's incorrect about this.
There are some interesting differences when you break that down by partisanship. To jump into it, the Republicans are more likely to think it was a Democratic majority.
Still, despite the arguments about Republican control over appointments during the Trump administration in particular, and the role that judicial appointments played in the Senate in the debates about Merrick Garland's nomination during the Obama years that was blocked in the Senate. And there are not huge differences here, but about 30% of Republicans think there's a majority appointed by Democratic presidents. That's true of 20% of Democrats. So there's substantial misperception on both parties' sides. But Among Republicans, only 22% are certain that there's a majority appointed by Republican presidents versus 39%, not quite twice as many among Democrats. So it may just be that if you're on the wrong side of that issue, you're more aware of it as Democrats, or if you're a Republican, you have less need to know that. But it is clear that the side that's most benefited from Supreme Court appointments during the Trump era is also the political party that's a little less clear that they actually won that nomination battle, those nomination battles. And so, and in our latest surveys, those discrepancies are even a little bit stronger, with Democrats even a little more aware of this. I think the bottom line is, first of all, as we'll see in a moment, this measure of knowledge of who has appointed a majority of justices turns out to line up very well with knowledge of other things about the court. And it's a good way for us to track a basic bit of information that's also politically relevant as well.
One of those things that it tracks with is ability to have an opinion of what individual justices are doing.
Right. And here, first of all, we asked, not in this survey, but we've asked several times over the last few years, respondents to say whether they have a favorable or an unfavorable opinion of each of the 9 justices. But we also invite them to say, I've not heard of this justice, or I've heard of the name, but I don't know enough to give a rating. So this is a harder set of items about how much do you know. I certainly have to pause and think for a while before I can name all 9 justices. And again, I get paid to do this. But the point here is, again, knowledge of the court is really strongly related here to knowledge of the appointing majority. Of those who incorrectly think there's a Democratic majority, the median number of justices rated on this favorability scale was 1 out of 9. And the average was 2.4, the mean. So those with the most incorrect knowledge of the composition of the court are also the least knowledgeable about the 9 justices and being able to give an opinion of them. When we move to those folks who think there's probably a Republican majority, the median number of justices rated is 3 and the mean is 3.7. So more, but still less than 4. Finally, when we get to those who are the most knowledgeable, the most certain that there is a Republican-appointed majority, those folks rate a median of 7 justices and a mean of 5.6. So there's a lot more ability to give opinions of the court and to say that these folks have some kind of impression of the justices as information goes up. And so again, this is an example of how knowledge of a really basic fact about the composition of the court turns out to be pretty strongly related to detailed knowledge, at least in terms of being able to give favorable opinions of justices. And again, is sort of the foundation of using measures of information about the court.
And are there partisan differences on these fronts?
Here, almost none. Whereas the composition of the court was related to partisanship, at least moderately so. On this measure of knowledge of individual justices, Republicans and Democrats are nearly identical, both giving a median of 4, rating a median of 4 justices. The one exception here is independents, who are much less informed about the court, giving a median rating of only 1 justice. But Republicans and Democrats, very little difference in knowledge of individual justices, but independents, who in general pay less attention to politics than partisans, much less knowledge.
We asked a question here that I don't believe we've asked before, and it's a kind of an unusual question. Do you know who wrote who was the main author of the Dobbs decision.
This is an unusual question, especially given what we just said about knowledge of the court. On the other hand, the Dobbs decision has easily been the most visible and most controversial decision of recent years. So we thought it would be interesting to see how much information about authorship does get through to the public. Now, certainly we didn't do this with the expectation that most people would be able to say that Justice Samuel Alito was the author of the Dobbs decision, which he was. But we wanted to see how the public did get or not get that information. When we look at all respondents in the survey, 25% correctly say Samuel Alito, but an equal 25% incorrectly say Justice Clarence Thomas was the author. Now, it's a little confusing in that Justice Thomas did write a concurring opinion, but he didn't write the main decision. And so here what we see is those two are the two most often named. Another way to think about this is if we invited people, if they didn't know the answer, to just give it your best guess. So if people simply guessed randomly across the 9 justices, we would expect each of the 9 to get about 11% mentions if they were all just throwing darts at a dartboard, at least throwing darts the way I do without very much effective aim. But what we found was, in fact, these 2 justices, Alito and Thomas, got half of the respondents. And of the other justices, only Chief Justice John Roberts got mentioned more than 11%, and they are only 12% picked him, not meaningfully different from 11. Finally, the 3 justices that dissented in the Dobbs decision, all are chosen by less than 6% or less. And so you wouldn't call this sharp knowledge, and we'll see how it sharpens in a moment. But what you do see is some rough fit between the 2 justices most associated with the Dobbs decision as author and as concurring opinion author. Excuse me. Fall allergies, I'm sure. And you see less incorrect belief that the 3 dissenters might possibly be the author. So the bottom line is a little bit of a fit here, but hold on, there's more. Let's get to those who know more and who knows less.
Okay.
So we just went through this issue about knowledge of which president's party appointed the majority of the court as a simple measure of knowledge. When we look at those folks who are least knowledgeable of the court, who believe there's a Democratic, a majority appointed by Democratic presidents, here the opinions are much flatter across the justices. There's less differentiation between them, and Justice Thomas is the largest pick, the most popular pick at 19%. Alito's at 13%, but here the distribution of answers looks closer to random. Not quite 11% for each one, but still a much flatter distribution. When we go to those who think there's probably a Republican majority, Thomas moves ahead at 31%, Alito at 17%. So here, misinformation attributing to Clarence Thomas. But finally, when we look at those folks that are most knowledgeable of the court, who know that there is a majority appointed by Republican presidents, now Justice Alito is seen as the author by 43%, and Thomas by only a little more than half of that, 23%. So this is a nice demonstration that of the folks with the least information and incorrect information, answers look pretty close to random. Of those with some information, but not as much as the others, Thomas gets more attributions. But finally, when we look at the folks who are most knowledgeable of the court, Justice Alito is the top pick at 53%. Thomas at 23, as I say, is a concurring opinion, so those two together give us about 2/3, 66%, who pick either Alito or Thomas as the authors. And there's not very much incorrect attribution of authorship to any one other justice.
The Dobbs case was an exception to most Supreme Court actions, even more prominent cases, in that it really broke through to people's awareness. Has that been continuing?
It is, and this is quite interesting because in previous studies of even major Supreme Court decisions, we found that awareness of a decision peaks right after the decision is handed down, and then over the course of the summer and fall, people forget about that decision. This is not uncommon, but it's especially true with the court. But on the Dobbs decision, that's barely happened. In July, 81% said they'd heard a lot about the Dobbs decision. That actually went up in September to 84%, and it's fallen a little bit to 76% now. But to put those in perspective, let's look at that major Second Amendment gun rights case that we talked about before that also came down in June. Right after that decision came down, 47% said they'd heard a lot about that versus the 81% that had heard a lot about the abortion decision. But on the gun rights case, that has fallen from 47 to 31% in September to now just 25% in November. So again, arguably the gun rights case was a pretty major case, but it has not stayed in the public consciousness, and the amount people hear about it has steadily declined, much more in line with many other court decisions that we've monitored in the past,
right,
but
yeah,
decidedly different from the Dobbs decision.
And how does that apply to some of the pending cases which we discussed earlier?
Well, we mentioned earlier that a lot of these pending cases are pretty invisible, and that's true on this measure as well. The use of race in college admissions case, for example, only 20% say they've heard a lot about that. 45% have heard a little, but fully a third, 34%, nothing at all. So again, look at the gap between nearly 80% having heard of Dobbs versus 20% having heard a lot in this case.
An interesting comparison that puts in perspective the relatively low profile of these things is comparing to other news events.
And so one of those is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 70% say they've heard a lot about that. That, of course, is an ongoing issue, not an episodic issue like the court decision. But the other is the January 6th hearings by the House Select Committee. In July, 43% had heard a lot about that, and in September that bumped up to 52%, but has fallen back to 43% now. So their attention to the January 6th hearings are more in line with the gun decision, though the gun decision has now faded below these levels, but is below the level of attention to Dobbs, which, as I say, remains really extraordinarily high for any court decision.
Let's turn to a question you mentioned briefly before, which is, do people think the Supreme Court should pay attention to what people think?
And here there has been a bit of a shift. In September of 2020, when we first asked this, 44% said the court should consider public opinion when it reaches decisions on cases, but a majority, 55%, said it should ignore public opinion. Those numbers have more than flipped in this latest survey, with 61% saying the court should pay attention to public opinion, 39% not. Again, this pretty obviously flows out of controversy over the recent decisions in Dobbs, but also in the gun case and others. But one that has shifted the public to exerting a little more demand on the court that it not ignore public opinion in reaching decisions, the justices, of course, would say they're following the law and interpretive standards, not simply a barometer for public opinion. But the public does think that it should have a little more of a role in the considerations of justices than they did 2 years ago.
And there have been debates in the last several years, including a commission that was appointed by President Biden to look at some changes in the court, whether they should be considered. Where are people holding on a couple of those ideas?
Yeah, on expanding the court, there's been only a modest increase in support for expanding the court, and that's fluctuated at a near even divide recently. Back in 2019, 43% favored expanding the court, 56% opposed it. Now it's 47% favoring expansion, 53% opposed. Last time in September, for the first time, we saw that those in favor of expansion tipped up to 51%, though it's, as I say, now back down just under 50%. I think the takeaway on this is the public's pretty evenly divided on the question of expansion, and at most we've seen small single-digit percentage changes in that opinion over the last year or so, including over the period of time that the Biden-appointed committee to look into Supreme Court reforms was meeting and issued its report.
So when you put it all together, do people have confidence in the court?
As with approval, there's been some decline in confidence. In 2019, 37% said they had a great deal or quite a lot. That's fallen of confidence in the Supreme Court. That's fallen to 30% now. Those with little or no confidence was 20% in 2019 and is up to 33% now. So there has been a decline in confidence in the institution, though it's not extreme, but it has moved about 7 or 13 points, depending on which standard you use here. We do see a fair number of people that say they have some confidence, a sort of middle category. And I have to say that middle category is pretty popular when we ask about a number of American institutions. In most of the questions we ask, some confidence is the most common category, and that's true of the court now, with 36% saying they have some confidence in it.
We also asked about what people think, and this is across all 50 states, what people think of the Supreme Court of their own state.
And here, something of the same story. There are fewer people with very little confidence in their state Supreme Court, but there are not a lot more with a lot of confidence in their state Supreme Court. What happens is state courts are seen a little more to the middle here, with 40% saying they have some confidence, and 36% a great deal or a good bit, and 24% with little or none. So that's a little bit better for the state Supreme Courts, though again, as I said, with all of these institutions, the some confidence is still the most popular option.
I believe that would include the United States Congress.
It would, and Congress is sort of the perennial whipping boy on this question. But even for Congress, it's 43% with some confidence in Congress, 40% with little or none, 17% with a fair bit or a great deal, quite a lot or a great deal. And so while Congress doesn't get very many high marks, and a fair share of pretty low marks, even with that caveat, some confidence is sort of the common answer. State legislatures look a lot like Congress on this too. As with state Supreme Courts, they're not particularly, state legislatures are not particularly enjoy more confidence than the Congress, but they don't enjoy less either. It's, again, this middle category of some, with a little touch more on the high confidence end, but not a lot. We asked this question in thinking about federalism. We have a U.S. Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts. We have a U.S. Congress and state legislatures. Does the public respond to these different levels of federalism differently? So that's really what I'm interested in and trying to get at here. And the answer is only a little bit more favorable to our state institutions than our federal. And really the difference is in those sort of middle categories, there's not a lot of difference between state and federal institutions. Maybe a disappointment to those who hope that state institutions closer to the public might enjoy more confidence and just a little bit more. But it's not a difference of day and night between state and federal institutions.
And that brings us to the presidency.
Here,
how's that doing? And we're talking about the institution, and not an individual
yes,
president.
not the individual. Here, there's been a little bit of a rebound in confidence in the presidency over the last few years. Starting in 2022, we saw slightly fewer people saying they had low levels of confidence, slightly more saying high levels of confidence. And that middle category of some confidence rose from about 23 or 25% in 2019 and 20 to between 29 and 33% now. So a little bit of a rise in confidence in the presidency, but again, a relatively modest change.
There's been a lot of controversy, some of it with very definite partisan coloring, around local police and the FBI.
Two institutions involved in criminal justice issues. What we find is that confidence in the police is higher and confidence in the FBI lower. In this latest survey, 49% had either a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the police, while for the FBI, it was about 40%. So not a huge difference, but some difference. Also, on the low end of that, for the police, 22% little or no confidence, while for the FBI, 28% little or no confidence. So not a whole lot of difference there. But we do see pretty striking partisan differences with Republicans quite a lot more confident in the police than Democrats are, but Republicans less confident in the FBI and Democrats more confident in the FBI. I think this pretty transparently follows recent issues we've seen between the parties in reaction to policing and the issues there, and most recently issues of the FBI, including the search warrants at Mar-a-Lago, as well as the FBI's earlier involvement in the investigation of President Trump, which have turned these two institutions into somewhat more politicized institutions, at least through the eyes of the public.
A lot of interesting material here, lots of insight and lots of thoughts to chew on as to where people are holding in regard to the courts and the whole legal system. This is actually part one of a two-part release of results of our national survey. So the second part, this part is for release on Wednesday, November 30th. The second part, which deals more with political matters, is coming up for Thursday, December 1st. So stay tuned, and we'll be back with more insights. And I bet we'll be back in 2 months with a whole new round of surveying.
Oh my goodness, really?
Oh yeah, man,
oh,
it's coming right at us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in to not only this poll, but to the whole subject matter that we're dealing with here.